Before I can even start, you need to understand where I came from. It's all about my dad. John. The man was a freaking legend. Not like internet famous or anything, but in my world, he was bigger than life. John was a software engineer, one of those guys who got in on the ground floor of the tech boom back in the early 2000s. He worked for a giant company. Think FAANG level, but I'm not naming names for privacy reasons. He wasn't just any cog in the machine either. He was a builder. He created things. He actually helped change the world. I still remember how people talked about him. When I was a kid, total respect, but here's the kicker. He wasn't some stereotypical workaholic, detached dad. He showed up. He invested in me. I have this memory etched into my brain. I must have been 10 years old, maybe 11. It was late, around 8 p.m. Dad had just walked in the door after a brutal day. 12 hours, battling some major production crisis. He looked wrecked, that kind of bone-deep tired that bleeds into your eyes. I was drowning in algebra homework. Due the next day. I was freaking out. Instead of collapsing on the couch, which he totally deserved, he sat down with me. Patiently, he walked me through the concepts. He didn't just give me the answers. He explained why things worked. He even turned it into a mini lesson about how algebra was basically coding. Variables, equations, it was all the same logic. That's how his brain worked. He invested in my future. Every free moment he had, he invested in me. We had this old, beat-up ThinkPad that he'd rescued from the company's e-waste program. Every weekend, he'd sit with me, teaching me the basics. Started with Scratch when I was 8, moved up to Python by the time I was 11. He'd create these little coding challenges, turning them into games. Looking back now, I realize he was giving me a computer science education before I even hit middle school. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. Nice suburb outside Chicago. Good schools. Mom, Sarah, was a high school English teacher. Still is, actually. But we'll get to that later. We had this perfect little rhythm going. Mom grading papers at the kitchen table, Dad and I hunched over the ThinkPad, hammering out code. Pizza every Friday night, followed by some sci-fi flick. Star Wars, Star Trek, Blade Runner. Dad was a massive nerd, and he was proud of it. He created this whole world for me. Then the floor dropped out. It started with these weird stomach pains Dad had been getting. He brushed them off at first. Classic guy move, right? But Mom insisted he get it checked out. That's when we got the news that still haunts me to this day. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. If you know anything about cancer, you know that's basically a death sentence. The doctors gave him 6 to 12 months. He made it 6. But even while he was dying, he was planning, thinking ahead. He'd already set up a college fund for me, years ago, but now he went into overdrive. He wanted to make sure everything would be all right after he was gone. He got everything legally locked down tight. A trust fund, life insurance, everything organized down to the last detail. He even wrote this letter to me. A letter I wasn't supposed to open until I got into college. I'm tearing up just thinking about it. The last real conversation I had with him. He was in the hospital. He could barely talk at that point. He grabbed my hand, squeezed it hard. He made me promise 2 things. 1, that I'd never stop learning, and 2, that I'd take care of Mom. I was 12 years old, trying to act tough, but just absolutely breaking inside, I promised. He was gone just a few days later. After he passed, things were rough. Real rough. Mom took a leave of absence from teaching. I kind of threw myself into studying. It was like, if I couldn't have my dad physically there teaching me anymore, I could at least honor him by learning everything I could. I started teaching myself more advanced programming, stayed after school for extra math help, joined every academic club I could find. Looking back, it was probably my way of dealing with grief. But hey, at least it was productive. We managed okay for those first few years. The life insurance meant we could keep the house. Mom eventually went back to teaching. We had this new routine, just the 2 of us. She'd help me with English essays. I'd help her figure out how to use Google Classroom. Seriously, how do teachers struggle so much with tech? It wasn't the same as before, but we were making it work. Then Mom met Richard. And holy hell, did that ever change everything? Mom met Richard about 3 years after Dad passed. Looking back now, I can see all the red flags, waving like a freaking parade. But at the time, I was just a 15-year-old kid trying to deal with having some random dude suddenly inserted into our lives. They met through some local Facebook group for single parents. Yeah, I know. Already sus, right? Richard owned a car dealership in town, one of those buy here, pay here places that prey on people with bad credit. He talked a big game about being an entrepreneur, a self-made man. But honestly, the place looked shadier than a palm tree in Antarctica. The kind of spot where the car's odometers mysteriously rolled back and the finance terms were written in font size 0.5. First time I met him, he showed up at our house in this leased BMW. Found out later he was 3 months behind on payments, wearing one of those tacky Omega watches that you can spot as fake from a mile away. But Mom, man, she ate it all up. She'd been lonely, you know? Teaching all day, coming home to just me and my textbooks. Richard swooped in with his charming businessman act, taking her to fancy restaurants, buying her flowers. Classic love-bombing stuff that I didn't have the life experience to recognize back then. But the real cherry on top of this sundae? His son, Kevin. Holy crap. Where do I even start with Kevin? Imagine every douchebag high school movie character rolled into one person. Then subtract about 50 IQ points. Kevin was a year older than me, but had already been held back twice. He'd swagger around in these designer clothes his dad bought him, probably with money from scamming people at the dealership, acting like he was some kind of suburban Tony Montana. His Instagram bio literally said future CEO, even though the only thing he'd ever successfully managed was to avoid getting a job. Richard moved in with us after dating Mom for like 6 months. 6 months. And suddenly, I'm sharing my house with these two clowns. Kevin got the guest room, which was right next to mine. And that's when the real fun began. This dude would blast his terrible SoundCloud rapper wannabe music at 2 a.m. when I was trying to study. He'd go through my stuff when I wasn't home. I found him wearing one of my dad's old MIT hoodies once and nearly lost my damn mind. But the worst part was the way he acted around my female friends. Quick example, my friend, Chloe, not her real name, came over to work on a coding project. Kevin spent the entire time lurking around, making these gross comments, and later, I heard rumors at school that he was spreading lies about her, saying she was easy. I had to stop having friends over because of his creepy behavior. Richard wasn't any better as a stepfather. He'd try to give me these condescending life advice sessions, usually starting with, "Now, son." I shut that son down real quick. Told him straight up that I already had a dad, and he wasn't him. His favorite topic was how college was a scam and how I should learn real-world business from him instead. Yeah, because your dying car dealership is totally the Harvard Business School of the real world, Richard. But the worst part, watching Mom change. She used to be this strong, independent woman who taught her students about feminist literature and standing up for themselves. But around Richard, she turned into this completely different person, constantly seeking his approval, laughing at his stupid jokes, making excuses for his and Kevin's behavior. I tried to talk to her about it once. Showed her the Better Business Bureau complaints about Richard's dealership. Told her about Kevin's creepy behavior. You know what she said? "We need to give them a chance. Richard's had a hard life, and Kevin just needs a mother's influence." Like, what about my hard life? What about the fact that I lost my dad and now had to watch this discount Jordan Belfort wannabe take over our home? The dynamic in the house got real weird, real fast. Richard and Kevin would have these loud conversations about hustling and grinding, their favorite words, usually involving some sketchy scheme or another. Meanwhile, I'm in my room, actually grinding, studying, coding, trying to maintain my 4.0 GPA. The contrast was almost comical. Oh, and get this. Richard started reorganizing our family finances about a month after moving in. Started asking Mom about her savings, my college fund, everything. He had this whole pitch about how he could invest it in his business and triple our money. Classic con man stuff. Thank God Dad had the foresight to lock down my college fund in a trust, or it probably would have disappeared faster than my respect for Mom's judgment. The real kicker? Mom started pulling away from everything that connected us to Dad. His books disappeared from the living room shelves. His old MIT sweatshirt that she used to wear around the house? Suddenly nowhere to be found. It was like she was trying to erase our past to make room for this new family. Looking back, I should have seen what was coming. The way Richard would get this calculating look in his eyes whenever the topic of my future came up. The way Kevin would make these snide comments about me being a try-hard whenever I aced a test. They were laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the biggest betrayal of my life. While Richard and Kevin were turning our house into their personal circus, I was on my own mission. Operation Escape Velocity. Looking back now, I probably took the whole grinding thing to an unhealthy level. But man, when you've got a dream and a toxic home environment, you'll do anything to make it happen. My daily routine was insane. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. to avoid running into Kevin and Richard in the kitchen. Nothing kills your appetite like watching Kevin shovel Lucky Charms into his face while bragging about his latest business idea, which usually involved dropshipping fake Supreme merch or whatever get-rich-quick scheme he'd found on TikTok that week. First period started at 7:30, but I'd get to school by 6:45 to use the computer lab. Our school's computers were ancient AF, but they were better than trying to code at home where Kevin would constantly interrupt me with his BS. Plus, the early morning quiet helped me focus. The janitor, Mr. Garcia, would always let me in early. Shout out to that man. He'd even bring me coffee sometimes when he saw me struggling with a particularly nasty debugging session. My course load was pretty much academic suicide. AP Computer Science, AP Calc BC, AP Physics C, AP Lang, you name it. The guidance counselor actually tried to talk me out of it, said it was too much pressure, but pressure was nothing compared to listening to Richard's daily lectures about how book smarts don't equal street smarts while he ran his dealership into the ground. The real tough part was balancing everything with SAT prep. I couldn't afford those fancy prep courses that all the rich kids in my school were taking, so I basically lived at the public library. They had these old SAT prep books from like 2015, but hey, math is math, right? I'd study there until closing time just to avoid going home. The librarian, Ms. Evans, would sometimes forget to announce closing time when she saw me deep in practice problems. Again, shout out to all the adults who saw what was going on and tried to help in their own ways. My scores started out decent, but not great. 1380 on my first practice test. Not bad, but not Ivy League material. So I doubled down. Started doing these marathon study sessions on weekends. I'd take a practice test, review every single question I got wrong, make flashcards for every vocabulary word I didn't know. By my final SAT, I hit 1580. When I got the score back, I literally cried in the school bathroom for like 20 minutes. The whole time, Kevin would make these snide comments about me being a try-hard or a teacher's pet. He was probably jealous, but honestly, I didn't care. Every time he or Richard tried to get under my skin, I'd just think about my dad's MIT graduation photo and keep pushing. The extracurriculars were another whole level of crazy. Besides the coding club, I was doing debate team captain by junior year, volunteering at a local tech literacy program for seniors, teaching old folks how to avoid online scams. Ironically, I learned a lot of this from watching Richard's business practices and working part-time at a local computer repair shop. Mom, well, she tried to be supportive in her own way. She'd leave dinner in the microwave for me when I got home late from activities. Sometimes she'd try to talk to me about college plans, but Richard would always interrupt with some story about a self-made millionaire who never went to college. It was like watching someone you love slowly disappear into someone else's shadow. The worst part? I was killing myself trying to make this dream happen, while Kevin was literally doing nothing, like actually nothing. He dropped out of community college after 3 weeks, claimed the professors were haters who didn't understand his entrepreneurial mindset, and spent his days either sleeping or hanging out at his dad's dealership, allegedly learning the business of running a failing car lot into the ground while scamming people. Great career path. But you know what kept me going? Those quiet moments in the morning, coding in the computer lab, when I could almost feel my dad's presence, like he was looking over my shoulder, proud of what I was building. Every line of code, every solved math problem, every perfect test score, they were all building blocks for my escape plan. Then came the college applications. And holy hell, did that ever open up a whole new can of worms? March 28th, 2023. I remember the date because it was the day everything changed. It was a Tuesday around 6:30 p.m. I was in my usual spot at the public library, trying to focus on some AP physics homework, but really just obsessively refreshing my email every 30 seconds. Ivy Day. Decisions were dropping, and my stomach felt like it was hosting an Olympic gymnastics competition. I'd applied to 7 schools total, 3 safety schools, already got in, 3 target schools, got into 2, and my dream school. Now, I'm trying to stay anonymous here, but let's just say it's one of those places where the acceptance rate is lower than Kevin's GPA. Their CS program is consistently ranked in the top 3 nationally, and their graduates basically get to print their own job offers. Dad always talked about it. So I'm sitting there, sweating bullets, when the email notification pops up. The subject line just says, "Update on your application status." My hands were shaking so bad, I actually misclicked twice before managing to open it. Then I saw those magic words. Congratulations. I literally had to read it 5 times to believe it was real. The librarian, Ms. Evans, probably thought I was having a seizure or something because I just sat there completely frozen for like a solid minute. Then I started crying. Not like subtle, manly tears either. We're talking full-on ugly crying in the middle of the reference section. Ms. Evans came over to check if I was okay, and when I showed her the email, she actually hugged me. Started crying herself a little bit. She'd seen how hard I'd worked, staying there until closing time almost every day for 2 years straight. Told me she was going to frame the newspaper article when I eventually won my Nobel Prize. No pressure, right? I called Mom first, obviously. She was still at school, grading papers in her classroom. When I told her, she screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Said she was coming home right away to celebrate. For a moment, just a moment, it felt like old times. Like when I'd won that state science fair in middle school, and Dad had taken us all out for ice cream. I got home around 7:30 and Mom was already there. She'd bought champagne, the cheap stuff, but still, and was literally dancing around the kitchen. Kept hugging me and saying how proud Dad would be. It was perfect. Should have known it wouldn't last. Richard and Kevin got home around 8. They'd been at the dealership probably trying to figure out how to make a Honda Civic with 200,000 miles look like it had only been gently used by a little old lady for church on Sundays. Mom was mid-happy dance when they walked in, and I swear to God the temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. Richard did this thing where he tries to look concerned but just ends up looking constipated. Asked me where I'd applied, how much it would cost. All these questions that had nothing to do with, actually congratulating me. I explained about my dad's college fund, thinking that would settle it. Big mistake. Richard's face did this weird twitch thing. He looked at Mom and said, "Oh, that money." Like he'd been thinking about my college fund for a while, which, looking back, he probably had been. Then he starts in with this BS about how I should have looped them in on my plans, because apparently I needed their permission to apply to college. Kevin, being the emotional support douchebag that he is, starts going on about how unfair it is that I'm showing off when he chose to go to community college, for 3 weeks, remember, because he understands the value of starting small. This coming from the guy who once tried to convince Richard to buy him a Tesla because, and I quote, "It's an investment in my personal brand." But the real gut punch came later that night. Mom came to my room around midnight, looking like she'd been crying. Said we needed to talk. Those 3 words that never lead to anything good. Turns out, Richard had been planning to use my college fund to expand the dealership. Had this whole presentation ready about how he could triple the money in 2 years. Mom had apparently been stalling him, saying they needed to wait for the right time. But now that I'd actually gotten in somewhere, the crap was hitting the fan. Richard had given her an ultimatum. Either convince me to reconsider my college choice and let him invest the money, or, well, he had some choice words about their marriage. And Mom, my own mother, was sitting there asking me to think about the family. What family? The one where my stepdad was trying to steal my dead father's last gift to me? Where my stepbrother spent his days making TikToks about being a future millionaire while actually contributing nothing to society? That family? I showed Mom the letter Dad had written me, the one I was supposed to open when I got into college. In it, he talked about how proud he was, how he knew I'd do great things, how the money he'd saved was his way of making sure I could chase my dreams without worrying about debt. Mom read it, cried some more, but still insisted we needed to find a compromise. That's when I realized this wasn't just about college anymore. This was about choosing between my dad's dreams for me and my mom's new life, between my future and Richard's latest get-rich-quick scheme, between who I wanted to be and who they wanted me to become. And let me tell you what happened next makes Game of Thrones look like a kindergarten playground dispute. The morning after my acceptance, I woke up to find Richard sitting at our kitchen table with this stack of papers in front of him, like he was about to conduct a corporate board meeting. Mom was there too, looking like she hadn't slept at all, nervously fiddling with her coffee mug, the one my dad had gotten her from MIT's campus store years ago. The sight of that mug in this context made my stomach turn. Richard had prepared an actual PowerPoint presentation. I wish I was joking. This man really made a slideshow titled Family Financial Planning, a strategic approach to collective success. Looking back, I have to admire the sheer audacity of trying to corporate speak his way into stealing my college fund. The presentation was exactly what you'd expect from someone who learned business strategy from YouTube motivational speakers. Lots of clip art, graphs showing exponential growth, buzzwords like synergy and market penetration, and absolutely zero actual financial data to back up his claims, his big plan. Use my college fund to buy a second dealership location that was going out of business, because clearly, the solution to running one failing business is to buy another one. I sat there for 30 minutes watching this man explain how he could turn my father's carefully saved money into a family empire. Every slide felt like a personal insult to my dad's memory. The worst part was watching Mom nodding along, occasionally throwing in supportive comments like, "Richard really knows the market," and "It's a great opportunity for all of us." When he finally finished, Richard leaned back in his chair with this smug look on his face, like he'd just presented the next Amazon business model. Then he hit me with the kicker. "So, sport," he always called me that when he was trying to be manipulative, "what do you think about taking a gap year? Give the business time to grow, then we can talk about college again." I lost it. Like, completely lost it. I told him exactly what I thought about his business acumen, how I'd looked up his dealership's BBB rating, F by the way, how I knew about the complaints filed against him for odometer fraud, how his current location was 3 months behind on rent. Thank God for public records and that business law elective I took. Richard's face went through this fascinating journey from smug to shocked to angry. Kevin, who'd been lurking in the doorway this whole time, started getting all puffed up like he was going to do something. But I wasn't done. I pulled out my phone and showed them the email I'd gotten from my dad's lawyer the night before. Yeah, I'd contacted him right after Mom's midnight visit. I wasn't born yesterday. The lawyer had confirmed what I already suspected. The trust was ironclad. Richard had no legal right to touch that money, and any attempt to coerce me or Mom into signing it over could be considered criminal. That's when things got ugly. Richard started yelling about how I was tearing this family apart with my selfish attitude. Rich words from a guy trying to steal a dead man's savings from his kid. Kevin joined in, calling me every name in the book. Mom just sat there, tears running down her face, occasionally mumbling something about finding a compromise. I looked at her and said something I still think about sometimes. "Mom, what would Dad think if he could see you right now?" The silence that followed was deafening. Then Richard made his final play. He turned to Mom and said, "It's time to make a choice. Either your son learns to be a team player, or..." He let the threat hang there, but we all knew what he meant. Mom stood up slowly, and for a second, just a second, I thought she was finally going to stand up to him. Instead, she looked at me with these sad eyes and said, "Maybe we could look at some schools closer to home, something more affordable." That was it. That was the moment I knew it was over. Not just my dream of going to my dad's alma mater, but my relationship with my mom as I knew it. She'd chosen Richard, chosen the illusion of security he provided over her own son's future. I went up to my room and started packing. Not everything. I wasn't stupid enough to let them know I was leaving for good. Just the essentials. My laptop, some clothes, Dad's MIT sweatshirt, and most importantly, all my important documents that I'd already gathered. Birth certificate, social security card, etc. Again, not my first rodeo. Called my best friend, Jake, whose parents had always treated me like a second son. They didn't even hesitate. Said I could stay with them as long as I needed. Jake's dad, a retired Marine who'd seen enough abuse in his time to recognize it, just said, "Pack your stuff, son. We've got a spare room." The next few days were a blur of legal meetings, bank visits, and paperwork. Mom kept trying to reason with me, alternating between guilt trips. "How could you do this to me?" and promises, "We can work this out as a family." Richard oscillated between threats and fake attempts at reconciliation. Kevin just glared at me whenever our paths crossed, probably realizing his dad's meal ticket was walking out the door. But you know what the craziest part was? In the midst of all this chaos, I felt this overwhelming sense of freedom. Like I could finally see everything clearly. I wasn't just fighting for my college fund anymore. I was fighting for my dad's legacy, for my future, and most importantly, for myself. The day I finally left, I took one last look at my mom. She was standing in the doorway, crying, begging me to stay. Richard was behind her, trying to look concerned, but probably already calculating how to spin this to the neighbors. I just said, "Dad would be disappointed," and walked away. You know those movies where the main character gets into their dream school and suddenly everything's perfect? Yeah, real life doesn't work that way. Those first few months were some of the toughest of my life. Moving into my dorm was weird. While other kids had their whole families helping them unpack, taking photos, crying about their babies growing up, I had Jake and his parents. Don't get me wrong, they were amazing. But watching other families say goodbye hit different. Mom had texted asking if she could come. I left her on read. Then there was Allison, keeping names changed. Met her in linear algebra. She's this absolute genius who could explain the most complex math concepts like she was teaching kindergarten. We started dating second semester. She was the first person I told the whole story to. About Mom, Richard, everything. She just listened, didn't judge, then helped me write a sorting algorithm at 3 a.m. because that's what I needed to distract myself. But life has a way of not letting you forget your past. Mom kept trying to reach out. Birthday cards, Christmas cards, random texts asking how I was doing. Most of them went unanswered. The few times I did reply, it was just, "I'm fine," or "thanks." Each message felt like picking at a scab that wasn't quite healed. Then came the internship season. Landing a FAing internship is like trying to win the lottery while solving a Rubik's Cube blindfolded. But somehow, I did it. Got the offer email during my algorithms class. The salary was more than Richard probably made in 3 months at his dealership. Found out later through Jake's mom that Richard's dealership had finally gone under. Apparently, he tried to pull some shady financing that backfired spectacularly. Kevin was working at a vape shop, still talking about being a future entrepreneur. Mom was still teaching, but things with Richard were tense. The internship itself? Freaking incredible. Spent the summer building actual products that millions of people would use. My team lead was this veteran engineer who reminded me so much of Dad. Same passion for mentoring, same terrible dad jokes. On my last day, he pulled me aside and offered me a return offer for after graduation. The compensation package made my eyes water. That night, Mom texted congratulating me on the offer. Turned out my project manager knew her through some teaching connection and had mentioned my performance. She said she wanted to visit, to make things right. Said she had things she needed to tell me. I stared at that text for hours. Part of me wanted to ignore it, like all the others. But another part remembered that little kid who used to grade papers with her at the kitchen table, who'd help her figure out how to use Google Classroom, who just wanted his mom back. I finally replied, "Okay, but we meet on my terms." Her response came seconds later. "Anything you want. I just want to see you." Life has a way of bringing things full circle. 4 years after I'd walked away from home with nothing but a backpack and a dream, I found myself sitting in a coffee shop near my apartment, waiting for my mom. The same mom who'd chosen her failing marriage over my future, who'd tried to convince me to give up my dreams for Richard's schemes, was about to walk through that door. I'd picked this spot carefully. Neutral ground. Public enough to keep things civil, private enough for real talk. Plus, their cold brew is actually decent. Allison had offered to stick around nearby, just in case, but this was something I needed to handle on my own. When Mom walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. She'd lost weight, looked older somehow. Gone was the confident high school teacher I remembered. The woman approaching my table looked beaten down. She was wearing Dad's old MIT Parents Weekend sweatshirt, the one I thought Richard had thrown out years ago. The first few minutes were awkward as hell. Small talk about the weather, how my classes were going, typical mom stuff. But there was this underlying tension, like we were both tiptoeing around a minefield of unspoken words. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, "Richard left me." Not exactly shocking news. Jake's mom had kept me updated on the neighborhood gossip. Apparently, after the dealership went bankrupt, Richard had tried to start some cryptocurrency scheme, because of course he did. When that failed, he'd split, leaving Mom with a mountain of debt and a broken marriage. But then she dropped the real bombshell. "He never wanted to invest your college money in the business," she said, staring into her coffee. "He wanted to use it to pay off gambling debts. The dealership was just a front. He'd been borrowing from some dangerous people." The pieces started falling into place. The constant pressure about the money, the desperate schemes, the way he'd almost panicked when I got accepted to college. Richard hadn't just been a failed businessman. He'd been running a whole other kind of operation. Mom started crying, not the manipulative tears I'd seen before, but real, raw sobs. She told me everything, how Richard had threatened her when she wouldn't sign over my trust fund, how he'd been stealing money from the dealership, how Kevin had been involved in some seriously sketchy stuff at that garage of his. "I was scared," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Not just of Richard, but of being alone after your father died. I thought I'd never find anyone else. Richard seemed so capable at first. By the time I realized what he really was, I was in too deep. But that's no excuse for what I did to you." She pulled out a worn envelope. Inside was a letter from Dad, dated a week before he died. He'd written it to Mom, asking her to protect my future, to make sure I had the chances he'd worked so hard to provide. She'd never shown it to Richard. "I failed him," she whispered. "I failed both of you." That's when I did something I hadn't done in 4 years. I reached across the table and took my mom's hand. "You didn't fail," I said. "You're here now." We talked for hours, real talk, not the surface-level stuff from her texts and calls. She told me about going to therapy, about rebuilding her life post Richard. I told her about college, about Allison, about the job offer. For the first time since Dad died, it felt like we were actually seeing each other. Then I asked her something that had been bugging me for years. "Why didn't you fight harder for me when I left?" She squeezed my hand and said, "Because you reminded me so much of your father. He never compromised on what was right, even when it was hard. When you stood up to Richard, I saw him in you. I knew you'd be okay." "But you weren't," I said. "No," she admitted. "But I am now, and I'd like to be part of your life again, if you'll let me." That's when I told her my news. I'd just closed on a small house near my new job. Nothing fancy, but it has a spare room. "It's yours if you want it," I said. "Fresh start." She started crying again, but this time with a smile. Pulled out her phone and showed me something. She'd been taking online coding classes. "Thought it was time I learned what all the fuss was about," she said. "Maybe you could help me sometime?" Just like that, something clicked back into place. Not the same as before. Too much had happened for that. But something new. Something honest. We're still working on it. Mom moved in last month. She's got a teaching job at a school nearby, and in the evenings I help her with her coding homework. Sometimes when we're both up late working, it feels almost like those nights back in high school, grading papers and debugging together. Last week she hung Dad's MIT graduation photo in her new room. Next to it, she put my college acceptance letter. "A reminder," she said, "of what happens when you believe in yourself." As for Richard and Kevin, last I heard they're running some sketchy NFT scheme in Florida. Good riddance. Allison thinks I'm crazy for giving Mom another chance. Maybe I am.